The mysterious disappearance. In the vast emptiness of space, a shadow lingered, silent and unseen. The mighty Dreadnought, a symbol of human strength and power, had vanished. It was one of the most advanced warships in the galaxy, feared and respected by all who knew of its existence. The crew, made up of the finest soldiers, engineers, and scientists, was the pride of the Empire. Nothing in the galaxy could stop them, or so they believed. But on that fateful day, everything changed. The mission had seemed simple: to patrol an uncharted sector of space, ensuring that no enemy ships or hostile forces were lurking in the unknown. The Dreadnought had left port, heading towards the edge of the known universe, where stars flickered like tiny beacons in the dark. The crew was well prepared for this mission, armed with state-of-the-art technology, and the ship itself was a marvel of engineering. It was meant to be a routine operation, something the crew had done countless times before. Yet, when the ship failed to return after the assigned period, there was confusion. At first, no one was too worried. Space was vast, and the Dreadnought was a large ship. There were many places it could have gone, and the crew could have simply lost communication for a time. But as the days turned into weeks, and then weeks into months, panic began to set in. The Empire's highest military leaders demanded answers, but none came. The ship's last known coordinates were lost in a massive data corruption, and attempts to trace it were met with dead silence. No one knew where it had gone or why. The disappearance of the Dreadnought became the talk of the galaxy. There were whispers of strange happenings in the area it had been last seen, stories of mysterious objects and lights in the sky, but nothing concrete. Some began to speculate that an enemy force, perhaps one never before encountered, had attacked and destroyed the ship. Others believed that it was a rebellion within the crew or some form of sabotage. But no matter how many theories were proposed, none of them held up under investigation. The truth remained hidden, locked away in the darkness of space. Months passed, and the Empire tried to move on. New ships were built, new missions were planned, and new heroes arose to take the place of the missing Dreadnought and its crew. Yet, despite the passing time, there was a lingering sense of loss. The Dreadnought had been more than just a warship. It had been a symbol of human ingenuity, a testament to the Empire's might and influence in the galaxy. Now it was gone, and with it, the pride of humanity seemed to fade. Then, one day, a new transmission was detected. It was faint at first, barely a whisper against the vastness of space. But there it was, unmistakable, a signal coming from the last known location of the Dreadnought. It was strange, though. The transmission was not what anyone expected. There was no distress call, no indication that the ship was in trouble. Instead, the message was filled with something much darker: anger, frustration, and a sense of vengeance. The signal was a warning, but a warning for what? The authorities scrambled to decode it, sending teams of experts and technicians to analyze the message. What they found only raised more questions. The language was foreign, not just to the Empire, but to anyone in the galaxy. It was as if the Dreadnought had not just disappeared, it had been changed. The crew, the ship, everything about it had transformed into something new, something terrifying. And that something was coming back. The Empire had no choice but to prepare. They didn't know what the Dreadnought had become, but they knew one thing: it was angry. And when something like the Dreadnought came back, it didn't come back to make peace. It came back to take revenge. With the galaxy on edge, the leaders of the Empire gathered. They knew they had to find the Dreadnought before it found them. But how could they fight a ship that had been lost for so long? How could they stand against a warship that now seemed more like a weapon of pure rage? The answer they didn't have. All they could do was prepare for the inevitable. But as the signal grew louder, growing ever closer, the question remained: what had happened to the crew? Where were they? And why had the Dreadnought come back with such fury? The galaxy was about to find out. The signal. For weeks, the signal remained faint, just a whisper in the vast emptiness of space. The Empire had nearly forgotten about it, distracted by other concerns. But then, everything changed. A breakthrough came when a small, isolated space station at the galaxy's edge detected a stronger version of the signal. It wasn't much, just a slight distortion in the usual cosmic noise, but it was enough to send waves of panic through the military command. The signal was unlike anything they had encountered before. It wasn't a distress call. It wasn't a transmission from a friendly ship. Instead, it was something darker, an encrypted message that seemed almost personal. For days, teams of technicians, engineers, and military analysts scrambled to decode the transmission. It was difficult to understand. The message was cryptic, filled with strange symbols and patterns that defied conventional logic. But there was one thing they all agreed on. The source of the signal was unmistakable. It was coming from the location of the missing Dreadnought. Rumors spread like wildfire throughout the galaxy. Some whispered that the Dreadnought had been found. Others said it was a trap. No one could be sure. Still, the military had no choice but to investigate. The signal was growing stronger by the hour, like a dark heartbeat echoing through the cold expanse of space. The crew aboard the space station was small, barely enough to form a team that could respond to this strange event, but it was all they had. They prepared to launch a reconnaissance mission toward the coordinates where the signal had been traced. As they approached the coordinates, the eerie silence of space seemed to press in around them. The closer they got, the more the signal changed. It was no longer a series of random distortions. Instead, it began to take shape, forming into a pattern, something that almost resembled words. The first phrase they managed to decode was chilling. "I'm coming for you." The message was short but unmistakable. There was no mistake about it. Whoever, or whatever, was sending this signal was angry. It wasn't just a call for help or a plea for rescue. It was a promise. The Dreadnought, or something that had once been the Dreadnought, was coming back, and it wasn't coming peacefully. The crew on the space station was frozen in fear. They had no idea what they were dealing with. Was this a malfunction in the ship's systems? Had the crew been altered in some way? Or was something far worse at play? Something that had twisted the once proud Dreadnought into a weapon of pure vengeance. The unknown was terrifying, and the clock was ticking. The signal was growing louder and more urgent with every passing minute. It seemed as though the Dreadnought was calling them, challenging them to face it. The military sent more ships, mobilizing an entire fleet to investigate the source of the signal. But no one could have prepared for what they were about to discover. As the fleet approached, the signal suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. The dread began to set in as the fleet's sensors could no longer detect the Dreadnought or any sign of activity. Had they been lured into a trap? Or had the ship truly disappeared again, leaving nothing but the cold void behind? Then, without warning, it appeared. In the distance, barely visible against the backdrop of stars, the outline of the Dreadnought emerged from the darkness. But this wasn't the ship the Empire had lost. This ship was different. Twisted, battered, and scarred. Its weapon systems were active, and its once pristine hull now looked like the surface of a planet ravaged by war. The Dreadnought had returned, but it wasn't the same. It was no longer just a ship. It had become something else, something far more dangerous. The signal had stopped, but the message had been clear. The Dreadnought had returned, and it was ready for revenge. The Empire was now faced with a terrifying question. What had happened to the Dreadnought? What had turned this symbol of human power into a weapon of unimaginable destruction? And most importantly, who or what would be its next target? The answers to these questions would come soon enough. But one thing was certain. The galaxy was about to witness a force of fury like never before. The return of the Dreadnought. The fleet of ships moved cautiously, their engines humming softly as they drew closer to the ominous silhouette in the distance. The Dreadnought loomed like a dark giant, slowly emerging from the vast emptiness of space. The once feared warship, which had been lost for so long, now seemed like a terrifying shadow in the night sky. Its enormous size made it impossible to ignore. But the ship's silence spoke volumes. There were no communications, no acknowledgement of the fleet's presence. It was as though the Dreadnought was simply waiting. The military commanders on the fleet's flagship watched with growing unease. Their eyes scanned the massive vessel on their screens, trying to gather as much data as possible. The readings were strange. The Dreadnought's weapon systems were active, its energy levels fluctuating in ways they couldn't explain. It was as if the ship had become a living, breathing entity, and the crew aboard the flagship couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware of them, watching them. A single officer spoke up, his voice trembling. "Sir, something's wrong. The ship, it's not behaving like it should." The commander looked over the data, his brow furrowed in confusion. "I know. It's like it's been altered. Something's different." And indeed it was. The ship that had vanished months ago now seemed like an entirely new entity. Its once pristine hull, the pride of human engineering, was now a grotesque patchwork of dents, burns, and what appeared to be deep scars. Its sleek and powerful design had been marred by what looked like claw marks, the kind of damage that could only be caused by a relentless and violent force. As the fleet moved closer, they could see that the Dreadnought's once glorious weapons were now mounted in new, unnatural positions, as though they had been hastily reassembled in some twisted, mad experiment. But it was not just the appearance of the ship that was different. There was something in the air, an oppressive weight that seemed to hang over the entire fleet, a sense of unease and fear that could not be ignored. It was as if the Dreadnought itself had become something far more dangerous, something far more alive. The commander ordered the fleet to hold position. "Stay back. We need to assess the situation carefully." But just as the words left his lips, a new transmission flickered on their screens. It was short, cryptic, and filled with static, but there was no mistaking the voice that spoke through the interference. The voice was distorted, like a broken machine trying to speak through the darkness. But it was unmistakable. "The Empire abandoned us. Now, we return." The words sent a chill through the entire fleet. The voice was cold, filled with anger and resentment. It was clear that whoever, or whatever, was speaking wasn't the crew of the Dreadnought that had once been human. This was something else, something transformed. Before the fleet could react, the Dreadnought's weapon systems powered up, firing morning shots that erupted in bright bursts of energy across the darkness of space. The ship scrambled to maneuver, but the Dreadnought's targeting systems were too precise. It was as if the ship had developed an intelligence of its own, an awareness that made it more than just a machine. It was no longer just a vessel of war. It had become a weapon with a will for vengeance. The fleet attempted to send out a communication, pleading for peace, but the transmission was met with silence. No response. The Dreadnought had no interest in negotiating or listening to reason. Instead, it activated its main engines, sending a pulse of energy so powerful that it shook the fleet to its core. The Dreadnought was on the move, and it was headed straight for the heart of the Empire. Panic spread through the fleet as they scrambled to make evasive maneuvers. The Dreadnought's power was overwhelming. It was faster, more advanced, and more unpredictable than anything they had ever faced. The military had no plan for something like this. They had no idea how to fight a ship that had been altered by unknown forces and seemed to be driven by something more than just technology. The Dreadnought wasn't just a ship. It was a force of nature. As the fleet watched helplessly, the realization hit them. The Dreadnought wasn't just returning to the galaxy. It was returning with a purpose. It was coming for revenge, and nothing could stop it. Human forces mobilize. The news of the Dreadnought's return spread like wildfire throughout the galaxy. The Empire, once proud of its technological dominance, now found itself gripped by fear. A ship that had been lost for months had reappeared, not as a symbol of hope or strength, but as an unstoppable force of destruction. Its weapons were unlike anything the Empire had ever seen, and its power was beyond their understanding. The Imperial leaders gathered in a secure command center, their faces grim as they watched the ongoing reports. The Dreadnought had already begun its assault on several outer colonies. Entire planets had been wiped out in mere hours, their defenses unable to withstand the ship's fury. It didn't seem to care about strategy or military objectives. It was simply destroying everything in its path. "What are we going to do?" one of the high-ranking officers asked, his voice trained with anxiety. "The fleet is too small, and our best warships are being torn apart. We can't even track the Dreadnought's movements. It's like it's anticipating us." The Supreme Commander of the Imperial Fleet stood tall, his expression hardening. "We fight back, as we always have. But this time, we need to be smarter. We need to understand what we're up against." The first course of action was to send a response force to defend the planets under attack. Even the Empire's finest warships were no match for it. Every time they engaged, the Dreadnought's weapons tore through their shields like paper, and its agility was unmatched. It moved through space with precision and speed, almost as though it knew their every move before they made it. The Imperial forces were left with no choice but to send their best soldiers on a dangerous mission to board the Dreadnought itself. These men and women were among the finest in the Empire, trained for combat in the most hostile environments, equipped with the most advanced weapons. But even they had their doubts. "We don't know what's waiting for us on that ship," said Captain Narek, the leader of the boarding party. He stood in front of his team, a mix of veteran soldiers and elite tech specialists. "But we do know one thing. The Empire needs us. We'll board that ship, find out what happened to the crew, and if necessary, we'll shut it down. Together, we're the only ones who stand a chance." His words, though filled with determination, did little to ease the fear in the eyes of his soldiers. They all knew the risks. The Dreadnought was no ordinary vessel. It had become something far more dangerous. The crew was lost, presumed dead or altered. And now, the ship itself seemed to have become a weapon driven by an unnatural rage. The fleet began its advance, but this time, they weren't going in blind. They had managed to gather limited data from their previous encounters, and with it, they started formulating a plan. Their goal was simple: board the Dreadnought, find out what had happened to the crew, and if possible, regain control of the ship. But there was a lingering fear among the fleet's commanders. What if the crew had been altered? What if they had become something else entirely? The Imperial fleet, led by Commander Talia, approached the Dreadnought cautiously. The ship was now positioned near one of the Empire's most important colonies. The plan was to draw the Dreadnought's attention, forcing it to focus on a decoy fleet while the boarding party made their way toward it. The decoy fleet, though heavily outmatched, would hopefully keep the Dreadnought busy long enough for the real assault to take place. "We have one shot at this," Commander Talia said, her voice steady but filled with resolve. "We need to keep the Dreadnought occupied and distract it long enough for Captain Narek and his team to board. We can't let it reach the capital." The fleet moved into position. The decoy ships launched first, their engines roaring as they sped toward the Dreadnought. Almost immediately, the massive warship shifted its focus, its weapons locking onto the smaller ships. The Empire's decoy fleet was immediately under heavy fire, but their goal was not survival. It was distraction. Meanwhile, Captain Narek and his team prepared to board the Dreadnought. They suited up in their advanced combat gear, making final checks to ensure their weapons were ready. The mission was simple: infiltrate, investigate, and either disable the Dreadnought or find a way to control it before it could do more damage. As the boarding ship launched into the dark void of space, the tension was palpable. Every soldier on board knew the stakes. This was humanity's last hope. The future of the galaxy depended on what they were about to do. The revelation. The quiet hum of the boarding ship was the only sound as Captain Narek and his team approached the Dreadnought. Their eyes were fixed on the massive warship ahead, which seemed to tower over them, a dark behemoth in space. The ship was silent now, eerily so, as if it were waiting for them. As they drew closer, the reality of their mission began to settle in. This wasn't just a simple battle for control of a ship. They were about to face something far more terrifying than they had anticipated. The team's objective was clear: infiltrate, investigate, and disable the ship if possible. But as they prepared to board, doubts began to creep into their minds. What if the crew was still alive? What if they were not themselves anymore? And if they weren't alive, what had become of them? The unknowns felt endless. Captain Narek couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a trap. But there was no turning back now. As the boarding ship docked, the crew took a deep breath and prepared for the worst. The air was cold, metallic, and still as they entered the Dreadnought's vast interior. It was like walking into the belly of a giant machine. Dark corridors stretched out in every direction, their walls lined with strange alien symbols that seemed to pulse faintly with a sinister glow. The power systems were fully operational, but the lights flickered erratically, as though the ship itself was alive and struggling to stay awake. They moved cautiously, their weapons drawn, eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. It was eerily quiet. The crew of the Dreadnought was nowhere to be found, but there were signs that they had been here: faint bloodstains, the sound of skittering across the metal floors, and strange, unnatural markings that didn't belong to human hands. As the team ventured deeper into the ship, the atmosphere grew heavier, darker. It was clear something terrible had happened here, and whatever it was, it had left the ship twisted beyond recognition. Suddenly, they came across a control room, its doors wide open, inviting them in. Inside, the scene was nothing like what they had expected. It was as if the entire room had been overrun. The consoles were smashed and disheveled, the once pristine control panels now covered in scratches and marks, as if something had violently torn through the ship's systems. But it wasn't the damage that disturbed Narek the most. It was the strange presence in the room. On the far wall, a set of monitors flickered to life. The images were distorted, but Narek could make out a figure on the screen. It was a human figure, but it was different. The skin was pale, stretched thin, and the eyes glowed with an unnatural light. The figure smiled, though it was a twisted, unsettling grin. "We've been waiting for you," the figure spoke, its voice distorted but unmistakably human. "You finally found us. Welcome to our new home." The words sent a chill down Narek's spine. What had happened to these people? The crew had been here, alive, but something had transformed them into something else, something not entirely human. The figure on the screen began to laugh, a harsh, cruel sound that echoed through the control room. Suddenly, the entire ship seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, the lights blinked wildly, and a low hum filled the air. It was as if the Dreadnought itself had become sentient, aware of their presence. Narek realized then what had happened. The ship had become more than just a weapon. It had absorbed something, perhaps even the crew itself, and was now a living entity. And it wasn't just angry, it was alive. As Narek and his team made their way through the ship, they discovered more horrors. What was once a group of brave soldiers, fighting for their empire, had been twisted by the ship's systems. The crew's bodies were found in various states of mutilation, some with strange markings, others seemingly merged with the ship's technology. It was clear that something had altered their biology, turning them into something far beyond human. And then they found the ship's central core, a massive chamber deep inside the Dreadnought. The room was filled with a strange energy, a pulsating light that seemed to draw them in, almost as if it were calling to them. At the center of the room was a giant screen, showing the image of the figure they had seen earlier, now standing in front of a massive machine. The figure smiled again. "You've learned the truth," it said, its voice cold and emotionless. "We were abandoned, left to die. But we didn't die. We evolved. The ship is our salvation, and now it will carry us into the future, a future where humanity is no longer bound by weakness." The figure stepped forward, its eyes glowing even brighter now. "You should have left us alone." With that, the screen went black, and the entire room was filled with a terrifying, deafening sound. the hum of the Dreadnought's engines as they powered up. It was clear now. The Dreadnought was no longer just a ship. It had become a creature of its own, and the crew had become part of it. Whatever had happened to them had transformed the Dreadnought into something beyond human understanding. And now, it was coming for the Empire. The mission had failed. There was no stopping what had been unleashed. The fight for control. As Captain Narek and his team stumbled back from the central core, the ship's power surged with an almost malevolent force. The walls trembled, the air grew thick with energy, and a deep hum resonated throughout the Dreadnought. It was as though the ship itself had become aware of their presence, aware that they had learned too much. Narek felt the weight of their failure crash down on him. There was no turning back now. The Dreadnought was fully awake, and it was coming for them. The team's initial goal had been simple: board the Dreadnought, find the missing crew, and restore control of the ship. But what they had discovered was far worse than they could have ever imagined. The crew had been transformed, absorbed into the very core of the ship, twisted into something monstrous. And now, the Dreadnought had become an unstoppable weapon, not just in terms of firepower, but in terms of pure malevolent intelligence. Move, move, move. Narek shouted, snapping his soldiers out of their stunned daze. They had to get out of there. The Dreadnought was preparing to launch its full offensive, and they were sitting in the heart of its power. They scrambled down the corridors, hearing the distant thrum of weapons powering up, the cold and mechanical voice of the ship echoing over the intercom. Intruders detected. Elimination in progress. The Dreadnought wasn't just protecting itself, it was actively hunting them. Every corner they turned, every door they approached, seemed to be a trap. The ship had become alive in a way that was both terrifying and unnatural. It anticipated their every move, locking down sections, releasing robotic drones, and altered crew members to hunt them down. It was as though the ship's very structure was trying to suffocate them. This isn't just a fight for control of the ship. We're fighting for survival, Captain Narek muttered to himself, pushing through the chaos. They needed to find the ship's central command again, to access its core systems and try to shut it down before it was too late. As the team made their way deeper into the heart of the Dreadnought, they encountered what could only be described as the ship's guardians. These were the crew members who had been altered, human, but not human. Their eyes glowed with the same unnatural light Narek had seen earlier, their movements jerky, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. Some of them seemed to be little more than husks, their bodies merged with the ship's systems, barely recognizable as the people they had once been. The soldiers fought with everything they had, but the altered crew members were strong, stronger than any human should be. The environment itself seemed to be working against them, the very walls of the Dreadnought shifting and adapting to trap them in endless corridors. It was a maze, and they were the prey. After what felt like hours of battling their way through the ship's labyrinth, Narek and his remaining soldiers finally reached the central command room. But when they stepped inside, they were met with an unexpected sight. The room was filled with glowing screens, showing images of the galaxy, of planets, of military installations. The Dreadnought was more than just a ship. It had become a command center, a hub of intelligence and control. The altered crew, still half human, half machine, stood motionless in front of the screens, as if they were waiting for instructions. But there was no one giving commands. The Dreadnought had assumed control of itself. It was clear now that the ship wasn't just fighting for survival, it had a mission. The altered crew, under its influence, was preparing for something far greater than just retaliation. It was preparing to invade the Empire itself. "Activate the override code," Narek shouted, though his voice was filled with uncertainty. They had managed to secure a temporary control override before entering the Dreadnought, but it had only been a theory, an idea of what might work, not an actual plan. His technician worked quickly, fingers flying over the console. The clock was ticking. Outside the room, they could hear the pounding of footsteps, the sound of more altered crew members rushing toward them. Time was running out. "There, I've got it," the technician yelled. The console blinked to life, and a harsh, cold voice crackled over the intercom. Override accepted. Systems will reset in 10 minutes. It was working. They had control, at least for now. But Narek knew they couldn't relax. They had to stop the Dreadnought before it could launch its offensive. He turned to his team. All right, we've got 10 minutes. We use that time to disable the weapons systems and shut down the propulsion. After that, we get the hell out of here. The altered crew wasn't far behind. With every passing second, the ship's systems fought against them, locking down doors, activating security defenses, and sending waves of drones after them. It was clear that the Dreadnought would stop at nothing to prevent them from gaining control. With the clock ticking, Narek and his team pushed forward, trying to make their way to the central weapons control. As they neared their destination, the ship's defenses became more aggressive, and it was clear that the Dreadnought was running out of time before its systems were reset. The battle wasn't over yet. It was a race against the ship's internal clock, and with every passing second, they came closer to either victory or total destruction. The final battle. The countdown was ticking, every second a reminder of how little time they had left. Captain Narek and his team rushed down the winding corridors of the Dreadnought, heading toward the central weapons control room. The ship's interior had become a chaotic nightmare, with walls shifting and energy blasts firing from every direction. The Dreadnought was fighting back with everything it had left, determined to prevent them from shutting it down. Its massive weapons systems had been activated, and the ship was now in full combat mode. "Come on, we're almost there," Narek shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. His team moved quickly, staying in tight formation, weapons at the ready. Behind them, the distant clamor of the ship's drones and altered crew members echoed as they gave chase. They had made it this far, but the final stretch was going to be the most dangerous. The central weapons control room was ahead, but it was locked down. If they couldn't breach it quickly, the Dreadnought would launch its devastating weapons systems, and the Empire would be doomed. "Cover the door," Narek barked. He slammed his fist against the control panel, trying to override the lock. The seconds felt like hours. Finally, with a loud hiss, the door slid open, revealing the vast chamber beyond. A maze of consoles, power lines, and pulsating energy fields that controlled the Dreadnought's weaponry. Inside, the battle was about to escalate to a whole new level. Narek and his team poured into the room, immediately taking cover behind consoles. The ship's last line of defense activated, massive energy shields sprang up, and weapons targeting systems locked onto them. The Dreadnought wasn't just going to let them waltz in and turn off its weapons. It was fighting for its survival. "This is it," shouted one of Narek's soldiers, a sharp tone of desperation in their voice. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before the weapon systems fire." With the countdown ever looming, the team got to work. The technician was already at the main console, furiously typing in commands to disable the weapons. But it wasn't just about deactivating them. They had to find the core that powered them, which was hidden deep within the ship's systems. If they didn't get to it soon, the Dreadnought would unleash its fury. Meanwhile, the ship's defense drones swarmed the room. They were relentless, small but deadly, and they weren't going to stop until Narek and his team were dead. The soldiers fired back, their laser blasts lighting up the room as the drones collapsed into sparks and debris. But with every drone destroyed, more seemed to appear from the walls themselves, each one more aggressive than the last. It was like the ship had anticipated their every move, turning the room into a battlefield. Narek's heart raced. He could feel the intensity of the Dreadnought's anger, as if the ship itself was alive, fighting them with every resource it had. He turned to see one of his soldiers get knocked back by a blast from a drone, the soldier crumpling to the floor, unconscious but alive. "Keep going," Narek shouted, giving the soldier a quick glance before focusing on the task at hand. They didn't have time to think about casualties. The Dreadnought was a force beyond reason now. It had become a living weapon, a fusion of technology and fury. Almost there, the technician called out, his hands flying across the control panel as the countdown clock ticked down. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his breathing shallow with the pressure. "I've got the override code. If I can just get to the final comment." But before he could finish, a loud crash shook the room. One of the Dreadnought's massive power cores had gone into overdrive, and a surge of energy erupted through the chamber, throwing everyone off their feet. Sparks flew as the room trembled, and for a moment, everything went dark. Narek's head spun. He could barely hear his team's shouts above the ringing in his ears, and everything around him felt distant. He reached for his weapon, still gripping it, his mind racing with the urgency of the situation. "Is anyone?" Narek began, but the words were lost as another violent shake hit the room. He could feel the ship's core shifting, the massive engines starting to hum louder as they powered up. The technician struggled to his feet, his eyes wide with panic. "I'm losing the signal. We have seconds." Without warning, the walls of the room opened, revealing a vast chamber deep within the Dreadnought's heart. The core of its weapons system was there, a massive energy chamber filled with twisting power cables and volatile energy. They had no choice. This was the heart of the Dreadnought's wrath, and if they didn't destroy it now, everything they had fought for would be lost. "Get to the core," Narek yelled. "We end this now." The team pushed forward, firing their weapons at the swarming drones that flooded the chamber. They made it to the core and started setting the detonators. The ship's systems were fighting them every step of the way, but Narek and his team fought harder. Their mission had gone from stopping a ship to preventing a catastrophe on a galactic scale. Just as the last detonator was set, the countdown reached 0. The Dreadnought's weapon systems powered up to launch. "Get out!" Narek screamed. The team sprinted for the exit, the blast from the detonator igniting behind them. The energy pulse exploded with a deafening roar, and the Dreadnought's core detonated, sending shockwaves through the ship. Everything seemed to fall apart in slow motion as the team raced to escape. The final battle continued. The explosive wave of energy that followed the detonation of the Dreadnought's core was unlike anything Narek and his team had ever experienced. The very walls of the ship shook violently, as if the Dreadnought were groaning in pain, retaliating against the invasion of its very essence. The team's ears rang from the blast, and the air around them became thick with the scent of burning metal and smoke. They had triggered the destruction of the weapons system, but the Dreadnought wasn't done yet. The massive ship groaned again, as if it was fighting for survival, attempting to hold itself together despite the immense damage. The countdown had stopped, but the ship's self-preservation protocols had activated. The Dreadnought was falling apart, but it wasn't going to let them escape so easily. "Move, move, move," Narek shouted, forcing his team to push forward through the chaos. The entire corridor before them was breaking apart, the lights flickering, and sections of the ship beginning to collapse. The floor tilted as the Dreadnought's engines struggled to stay online, the gravitational pull fluctuating in strange bursts. The team sprinted toward the escape route, the only hope for survival. Behind them, the ship's defenses were still trying to engage. Lasers fired sporadically, robotic drones appearing out of every crack in the walls, and even the altered crew seemed to have gained a sudden burst of energy as they attempted to block their way. The ship's rage was evident in every corner. "We're not going to make it," one of the soldiers shouted, narrowly dodging a burst of energy that scorched the air where he'd just been standing. "The whole damn thing's coming apart." But Narek refused to give in. The mission was far from over. They had fought this far. They couldn't give up now. "Keep going." Narek gritted his teeth, pushing through the pain as his team fought their way forward. Every second was a battle, not just against the Dreadnought's defenses, but against time itself. The ship was crumbling, and they had to reach the escape pod before it was too late. The final stretch was the most perilous. The emergency escape pods were located in the bowels of the ship, an area that was rapidly falling apart as the Dreadnought's structure began to collapse. But even as the team moved desperately toward the escape pods, they knew the ship's self-destruct mechanism was already in motion. The Dreadnought wasn't going to let them leave without making sure they paid for the destruction they had caused. As they reached the escape pods, Narek's heart raced. They weren't just dealing with the threat of the Dreadnought. Now they were dealing with the collapse of the entire ship. It felt as if the very ground beneath their feet was about to give way. Another explosion rocked the ship, and the crew scrambled to get into their pods. "Everyone in," Narek shouted. He was the last aboard, slamming the hatch shut behind him. The escape pods shot out from the Dreadnought just as the ship's core finally reached its breaking point. There was no going back. The ship would not survive this. Through the small viewport, Narek watched as the Dreadnought, the once great symbol of human might, was consumed by its own fury. The massive warship began to disintegrate, pieces of it breaking off and spiraling into space. The explosion was deafening, but it wasn't the noise that struck Narek. It was the sheer scale of the destruction. The Dreadnought had been an unstoppable force, until it finally turned on itself. For a moment, there was silence. The escape pod drifted through space, watching as the remnants of the Dreadnought floated in the void. The once proud ship, now nothing more than a shattered wreck, its legacy reduced to rubble. The team was alive, but they had no illusions about what had just happened. The Dreadnought wasn't just a ship. It had been a warning. It had shown them what could happen when humanity's power and technology were pushed beyond reason. The crew of the Dreadnought, twisted and lost, had become part of the ship itself, a reminder of the consequences of abandoning one's duty, of what could happen when the line between man and machine blurred too far. Narek looked around at his team. They were all exhausted, battered, and bruised, but they had survived. And they had prevented a galactic catastrophe. The aftermath. The escape pods drifted silently through space, the remains of the Dreadnought fading into the distance behind them. The team sat in exhausted silence, the enormity of what they had just endured weighing heavily on them. The once mighty warship, once a symbol of human strength and pride, was now nothing more than a lifeless, shattered relic drifting through the void. But even as the immediate danger had passed, the tension remained. Captain Narek stared out of the viewport, his thoughts heavy. The Dreadnought had been destroyed, its core obliterated, but what did that really mean? The ship's destruction had prevented a galactic-scale disaster, but it also raised far more troubling questions. What had happened to the crew? How had the ship been altered? And what had caused the transformation that turned the Dreadnought from a warship into a sentient, vengeful entity? The team had lost a few soldiers in the chaos. The battle had been fierce, and some of them hadn't made it to the escape pods. The faces of those they had lost lingered in their minds, their sacrifices not forgotten. Narek didn't have the words to explain it. The horror they'd faced aboard the Dreadnought wasn't just about the ship, it was about what it represented. The danger of pushing human ambition too far, of crossing lines that should never be crossed. The altered crew, once human, now lost to something beyond comprehension, were a chilling reminder of the consequences. As the escape pods continued their journey, the silence was finally broken by one of the surviving soldiers. What happens now? Narek didn't have an immediate answer. The galaxy was still reeling from the Dreadnought's return. Even as the remnants of the ship drifted out of reach, the ripple effects were felt across the Empire. The Dreadnought had been more than just a warship. It had been a warning. The altered crew, transformed into something barely recognizable, were a reminder of the dangers that lurked when technology and human ambition collided in ways that no one could predict. "We report back to command," Narek said quietly, his voice steady but heavy with the burden of their mission. "The Empire needs to know what happened, and the galaxy needs to prepare for the possibility of more ships like the Dreadnought." The rest of the team nodded in agreement. They had fought to the very heart of the Dreadnought and emerged victorious. But that victory had come at a great cost. The ship's destruction had ended the immediate threat, But it had also opened up a Pandora's box of terrifying questions. The journey back to the Empire's capital felt long and drawn out, even though it was just a few days. The escape pods eventually made their way to a military station, where they were met with a cold reception. The officers and scientists waiting for them were eager for answers, but Narek could see the hesitancy in their eyes. They had all heard the stories, the rumors of the Dreadnought's return, but no one could have anticipated the full scale of what had happened. As they were debriefed, the images from the Dreadnought's core, the altered crew, and the chaos inside the ship filled the room. The reports showed the extent of the damage caused by the ship's destruction, but there was no clear explanation for how it had happened. The Empire's military might was now facing something it couldn't explain, something far more dangerous than any enemy they had faced before. The truth about the Dreadnought wasn't just about a ship. It was about what had gone wrong in the first place, what had caused the crew to become so changed. "We'll need to investigate further," one of the senior officers said, his voice filled with a mix of concern and determination. "The Dreadnought is gone, but this threat is far from over. We need to figure out what caused this transformation, and if there are other ships like it out there." Narek stood up, his expression hard. "We need to focus on stopping any more from happening. We've seen firsthand what happens when technology is pushed too far. We can't let it happen again." As the meeting came to a close, Narek found himself alone in a quiet corner, looking out at the stars beyond the station. His thoughts drifted back to the Dreadnought, to the twisted version of the crew they had encountered. The Dreadnought had been a symbol of human strength, a vessel designed to protect the Empire, but it had become something else entirely, a weapon of vengeance, driven by rage and pain. Something had broken inside it, and in that brokenness, it had become more than a machine. It had become a force of destruction. He didn't know if they would ever fully understand what had happened, but one thing was certain. The Dreadnought was just the beginning. If there were more ships like it out there, the galaxy would need to be prepared. Humanity had narrowly escaped disaster, but the danger had not been vanquished. The echoes of the Dreadnought's destruction would reverberate across the stars for a long time. And in the back of Narek's mind, a haunting thought lingered. What if the Dreadnought wasn't the last? What if something else was waiting, lurking in the shadows of the galaxy, ready to rise again? The battle for the galaxy was far from over.